Well, you know what? I didn't want to jump to conclusions last night. I wanted to humor the news a little bit, even though we all pretty much knew that it was going to turn out this way. Uh, but there were questions up in the air. Okay, it could be an accident from somebody. Um, but then today, everything was shattered so quickly, so soon after the story broke last night. Overnight, it became clear this was 100% a Ukrainian false flag. And that doesn't mean that it started out that way. It still could have been an accident. Like I said yesterday, it could have been, maybe it was an accident. But I was saying if Russia did it at all, it would have had to have been by accident because, look at what they targeted. There was no targeting. This just blew up a poor farmer on a tractor in the middle of a field in Poland. And Ukraine instantly jumped on it and said, oh my gosh, look at this Russian provocation. We all must go to war with Russia immediately and punish them. NATO must declare war on Russia. We must have World War III. And that, for those of you following at home, that should set off your spidey senses. Because what did everybody else say? Hey, you know what? We need to gather some more information here and figure out what happened. Only Ukraine seemed to know what happened immediately. And lo and behold, it turns out that it was the Ukrainians behind it all along. Poland, the United States, they're both saying this. Every serious country is saying it. The only country that denies this is Ukraine itself, which still insists impotently that the Ruskies were behind this bombing of Poland. And the White House pathetically is trying to give some cover to Ukraine and their false flag by saying, well, ultimately this is Russia's fault because, Russia's attacking Ukraine and Ukraine, bombed Poland by accident in self-defense against Russia. Shut up. These rats in Kiev tried to start a third world war. Even if it was by accident initially, they capitalized on that and tried to leverage this potential mistake. At best, it's a mistake. They wanted to leverage it into a third world war. They wanted thermonuclear war between the world's two greatest nuclear powers. And yes, people say, well, China's a bigger power than Russia. China's not a bigger nuclear power than Russia, as far as we know. Russia, as far as we know, has more nukes than the United States, I believe. Certainly, they're capable of destroying the entire planet multiple times over, as is the United States. You put those two powers together, you put them at odds with one another, and you have the apocalypse. You have mutually assured destruction. This is something that people used to understand in the 1980s, but it's something that people have forgotten. It's something that people no longer believe. These disgusting, pathetic, left liberal, moderate, to even, right-leaning Ukraine supporters in the West, in the United States, are all cheering this on, excusing what Ukraine has done, and saying, well, even if they were successful in their false flag, well, it's not like that would escalate to nuclear war. Everyone knows Russia would never use nukes. Yeah, in every other context, they warn us, oh my gosh, Putin's going to use nukes. Because he lost, some battle in some small town that you've never heard of in, like, Kharkov Oblast or something. Oh my gosh, could Putin use tactical nukes and start, World War III over this loss in Ukraine? But they say, you know what, the U.S. could actually declare war on Russia, and Russia would never resort to using nukes. We could just beat them into submission. We could just dismantle Russia. We could just march into Moscow, overthrow their government, install some sort of Western puppet like, what's the guy's name? He's like the Lyndon LaRouche of Russia. Alexei Navalny. I had to pause and think about that for a minute. Alexei Navalny. He'll be the new president of Russia. And Putin, no, he would never use nukes over something like that. He would never use nukes to stop, American troops when they're banging down the gates of Moscow. And certainly, even if Putin initiated some kind of nuclear war, the U.S. would never respond in kind. No, the U.S. is just so restrained. Just like, it's asinine, and it's dangerous. If you want to talk about dangerous speech, it's people advocating for nuclear war. There's nothing else. If you were going to call any speech dangerous, it would be this speech. And yet you're perfectly free all you want on the internet. And I'm not saying people should be censored. I want the warmongers to expose themselves. These people are evil. Even if, they're banal. I mean, we all know the phrase, the banality of evil. The banality of evil is saying that nuclear war is no big deal, bro. What are you afraid of? Are you really going to let Putin continue his assault on democracy? Don't you know that Putin annexed Crimea and now he's invaded Ukraine? Don't you know this is the worst thing that's ever happened? Even if we risk billions of lives, literally billions of lives on this planet, humanity just hit 8 billion. That's our population right now. And all of their lives should be put in jeopardy. Hell, climate change? Who cares about climate change? Putin invaded Ukraine, don't you know? Who cares if nuclear winter would completely destroy the natural environment of this planet and, turn us into a second red planet? I've not said this before. I've said before that, actually initially when the war first started, I was somewhat sympathetic to Ukraine. Then I moved to being neutral and saying, you know what, you're just as bad as the Ruskies. And then I just went to saying, you know what, you guys, you do your thing. I don't care. Just keep me out of it. No, but they've tried to drag not just me, not just the U.S. They've tried to drag the whole world into their existential crisis. They think that they're so important that the entire world should be put at risk. And as far as I'm concerned, that is beyond evil. These people must be defeated. The regime in Kiev must be overthrown. I'm not saying I want the CIA to do it. The CIA already overthrew a couple regimes in Kiev. Hasn't worked out well. Keeps getting worse. But Ukraine is evil. It is trying, if successful, let's just put it in these terms. We always hear about the big boogeyman Hitler, who killed tens of millions of people with his Second World War. World War III would kill billions. Zelensky, if successful in this false flag operation, and that's the definition of what this is, Ukrainian missiles landed in Poland, and he wanted to paint Russian white, blue, and red on those missiles. He wanted to pin it all on Russia so that Poland, a hot-headed country with a long history of hatred and bias towards Russia for reasonable historical reasons, so that they would launch a preemptive strike on Russia, pulling all of NATO into a third world war. Luckily, Poland held their fire. They consulted with other NATO countries. They investigated, and they found out. And thankfully, they admitted, because if Poland really wanted to use this as a justification if the West in general, maybe Poland by itself wouldn't be enough, but if the West in general wanted to use this as a pretense to start World War III with Russia, they could have used it. They could have just lied and said, you know what, no, these are Russian missiles. We must retaliate against Russia immediately, just like Zelensky is saying. They could have gone right along with this. But no, what did I say yesterday? When the U.S. came out and said, we have to look into this. And they didn't immediately blame Russia. I said the U.S. is not in on this. Whatever happened here, I didn't know whether it was real, whether it was a false flag. I said the U.S. is not in on it. And they weren't, because the U.S. now has debunked Ukraine's claims. And so Ukraine is out on a limb by itself. And as I was saying earlier, if Zelensky had been, and Kuleba, and all these other people, these cretins, if they'd been successful, they would have killed way more people than Hitler, Stalin, or Mao combined. And not to mention destroying our climate for future generations. And yet you have brain-dead people across the political spectrum. It really is the new COVID. People are as brain-dead about this as they were about lockdowns and the jab and everything else. Zelensky and Ukraine can do no wrong. It doesn't matter if they lied and tried to start World War III. It's all justifiable, and even if everything you say is true, well, it wouldn't be that bad, and actually it'd be a good thing, because we need to have World War III, because don't you know, Putin invaded Ukraine in 2014. As if I should give a damn who's right and who's wrong. We're talking about the difference between tens of thousands of deaths and billions of deaths. Anyone who can't, who is even, has to think about that trade-off, who doesn't immediately recoil at the idea, is not only an unserious person, they are a fundamentally dangerous person. They're a person who certainly should not have the right to vote. They are mentally handicapped, a danger to themselves and others. This is something that Americans used to understand. Only the craziest, most warmongering and bloodthirsty generals in the Pentagon would advocate for such a thing once upon a time. And it took, JFK to stop them during the Cuban Missile Crisis. But, ordinary Americans understood. There is no option of war with Russia. That is the end of the world. That's what the Cold War was about. That's what kept the Cold War so cold. Because people knew you just can't do it. And here we have Zelensky playing Dr. Strangelove. If only Peter Sellers were alive to play Zelensky in the movie that will be made about this disastrous period in Western history. Not just, I almost said Eastern European history. And if your congressman is still voting to send money to Ukraine, I don't know what to say about that. And I know that, the vast majority of them are probably, 80-90% of people in Congress still voting to send more money to Ukraine. They're going to send money to Ukraine to replace these missiles that they wasted on this failed false flag. That's how screwed up our country is. We just have such a sick society. There's no other explanation for this. This is something that previous generations, for all their faults, this is a low that they did not sink to. We've never come this close to nuclear annihilation. People look back at the 1960s and say, oh, look, we had segregation, Americans were so backward back then. Well, at least in the 1960s, Americans understood that World War III would mean the end of civilization, and that would kill, at that time, millions, or maybe, I guess there were billions of people on the planet at that time, but, hundreds of millions back then at the very least, with the bombs that they had. And that's something that today Americans can't even comprehend. It's like you're talking to a wall. So with that said, fuck Ukraine, heartfelt.